I am rather famously not a fan of Starfield. When it originally came out, I do feel like I did my best to give it a fair shot. But within a handful of hours, I could tell that this game was, at the very least, not for me. The combat felt mindlessly dull, the exploration was non existent, the story and characters were just deeply uninteresting, and I could not get invested in the world building, and the game just felt like a loading screen simulator most of the time. Even the outpost and spaceship building systems weren't able to hook me, and I was one of the few people that actually enjoyed building settlements in Fallout 4, despite all of that game's flaws. So, the fact that Starfield was unable to hook me, even in that aspect, was kind of a bad sign. However, when you have one of these sorts of games that comes out to a widely negative reception, you usually get a lot of people that point to other success stories of games that managed to turn things around after a few years, like No Man's Sky and Cyberpunk. And I mean, sometimes that is fair. Every once in a while, if you let a studio cook long enough, you can get miracles regardless of what ingredients they were working with. So, with it having now been a couple of years since the launch of Starfield, and now that they're releasing it on PS5 with a bunch of new updates and everything, I figured that I may as well download and reinstall Starfield, boot up a new save file, and do my best to try and give it another fair shake with fresh eyes after all of this time with all of the new updates they've added to the game. So, how is Starfield now, after nearly 2.5 years of updates and changes? Well, right off the bat, I just have to say that I wasn't exactly thrilled about having to play through this intro again. I mean, seriously, I still don't understand who thought it was a great idea to start off this big, grand space exploration game in a tiny, dark cave being forced to mine random metals. Like, I guess they were trying to go for, like, contrast or the whole trying to replicate the whole leaving the vault moment, but, mining isn't even that much of a core gameplay element. Like, sure, it's important if you want to get into, like, outpost building and go heavy into crafting, but surely they could have tutorialized the resource gathering stuff when you actually start doing those parts of the game instead of front loading it for players that might never even go any deeper into those systems. But okay, before I get too sidetracked by this, let's move past this intro and focus on the actual new content and all of the updates they've added to the game. Like, I would have loved if they changed or tightened up the intro a bit, but I digress. To start things off, they have actually added a good number of quality of life improvements to the game. Improved widescreen support, an FOV slider, a bevy of difficulty options to customize your experience, an actual map screen for the various towns and planets in the game, not to mention countless bug fixes and patches. Like, I think that these are all pretty objectively good things that they've added to Starfield. Sure, if I was a little bit more cynical, I could say that maybe they should have included some of these things at launch. Like, I still don't understand how Bethesda keeps forgetting to include things like an FOV slider in the year of our Lord 2023, but to avoid getting sidetracked too much, I think it is hard to argue that the game isn't better off with all of these new features having been added to it. So, like, while minor, like, this is all pretty positive, good additions. But admittedly, this is all also very surface level stuff. While it is nice to have more options to customize your difficulty choices and bug fixes like that, small changes like these are never going to make that big of an impact on Starfield's overall quality of a game. Sure, having more options to customize my difficulty is nice, but that doesn't make combat suddenly become better all on its own. So, speaking of, what about the combat? You do a lot of gunplay in Starfield, and back when I first played it, I felt like it was somehow worse than even their prior games like Fallout 4. The main issue with Starfield's combat, at least at launch, was that the enemy variety was just kind of non-existent. Most of the time, especially when you're out exploring random planets, you're usually just fighting some generic humanoid enemies, like pirates or whatever, and really they only come in like one or two variations, man with gun or man with axe. And that's like 90% of the combat, because like, yeah, there are different guns that the various pirates might have equipped, like shotguns or rifles or whatever, but it doesn't change their behavior. the exact kind of rifle or gun that the random enemies I'm fighting has doesn't really change how I approach fighting them. They basically just always take cover behind something and then take pot shots at you whenever they can. And then if they have an axe equipped, then that's the only difference because they just charge at you instead. So most of the time, you tend to not even realize what kind of gun that most people have equipped until you loot it off of their body since it affects combat so little. And sure, you can also get into some fights with, xenofauna, alien creatures and whatnot, but most of the time, the combat against those creatures really just boils down to a reskinned man with axe style fight that might occasionally shoot some acid at you for, I guess, a little bit of variety. So, like I said, the main problem here, like, there's a lot of problems, but I would argue a big one is that the enemies just never really encourage you to change up your strategy or adapt to the situation or the environment. You can basically just pick whatever your favorite gun is, get a ton of ammo for it, and then you just take cover and start shooting, and then you'll basically win every fight. And once you start getting your dragon shouts, you can usually just stun entire groups of enemies so that they can't even fight back, and then combat becomes even more brain dead. And the only difference between normal enemies and bosses or captains and such was basically just how much of a bullet sponge they were. So that's the baseline critiques I had for the original game. So the question naturally is, how have things changed since launch? Well, to their credit, they actually specifically mentioned in one of their recent update videos that they have now added special enemy modifiers that certain enemies can spawn with that will help give them new abilities that will change up how you approach combat. However, when I was actually playing through the game again and trying to find some of these enemies, I barely even noticed that the enemies would fight differently at all, regardless of whether I had these traits enabled or not, or even what traits they had. And I didn't really have to change up my strategies or anything to fight them when they were present. Now, thankfully, thanks to the improved difficulty customization, we actually have a full list of all of the possible traits that the enemies can spawn with. And going through them and reading their descriptions, it's really no wonder that I didn't feel like it affected the quality of the game's combat. There's about 12 different traits that exist in the game, at least according to these options, and the vast majority of them don't actually do anything but make the enemies even tankier and essentially turn them into even more of a bullet sponge. I mean, seriously, just look at some of these. The Tricky ability has a chance to avoid damage, which just means that it takes more bullets to kill them. Tank, more straightforward, increases health. Specialist clouds your vision, which is at least a somewhat unique ability, but it also just heals themselves, so it takes longer to kill them. Shielded, resistant to damage, so it takes more damage to kill them. Medic heals nearby enemies, making those enemies into more of a bullet sponge. Leader, nearby enemies take less damage, functionally the same as Medic, just in a slightly different way. Behemoth, even more health than Tank. It's literally just Tank again, but bigger. All of these traits that I just listed are literally just different ways of making something take longer to kill. It doesn't change how you approach fighting those enemies, you just need to put more bullets into them before they die, and that's it. And as for the rest of the new features and traits, they're not really much better. The Berserker and Dangerous traits just kind of make enemies deal more damage, so again, it doesn't change your strategy of how you fight them, it just makes it so that it takes less bullets for them to kill you. And then the Martyr ability puts nearby enemies into a rage when you kill that unit, so it's kinda just Berserker again, but it affects multiple enemies at once. And then finally the Quick ability just increases their move speed. So there's only actually two traits in the entire game that actually do something unique beyond just generically boosting their stats in some arbitrary way, which is the aforementioned specialist ability that clouds your vision, and the new Pyro ability, which actually gives the unit fire grenades. And those are the only two traits that actually do something of note. So naturally, using these options out of curiosity, I set it to only spawn these enemy types specifically, just to see what they actually did and if they actually meaningfully affected combat. And well, when I fought the Specialist, it was mostly just annoying. Like, even when they apply the clouding to your vision, I could still aim and see them pretty trivially. Like, it didn't really affect how I approached combat. It just made me want to kill them more because it was just annoying to have that effect on my screen. So it didn't really affect anything. Though I will admit, the Pyromancer trait, that was a fair bit better. The fire grenades that they deploy are an actual threat that leave behind a lingering fire area that basically stops you from going wherever they land. So it is actually effective at flushing you out of cover, and in tight corridors, it can even force you to reposition or attack from a distance unless you're willing to take a lot of fire damage. So, credit where credit's due, this trait is actually pretty solid, at least compared to all of the others. But therein lies the problem. One decent enemy modifier isn't going to magically fix the Starfield's boring combat systems. Like, especially since ultimately, all that this does is just give an enemy a new weapon type with the fire grenades. It's not really something so unique that it warranted this entire new trait system to facilitate. In my opinion, at the very least, what they should have done is try to emphasize things like, instead of just adding traits that make enemies more durable so that they take longer to kill, maybe, like, what if instead they only give them resistance to certain types of damage? So, like, for example, a shielded enemy might be resistant to kinetic weapons, but is more vulnerable to energy weapons, so that, at the very least, the player is encouraged to swap between different types of guns during a fight, using one gun to take out the enemy's shields before switching over to another gun to actually damage their health, or maybe even things like being resistant to all ranged weapons, but vulnerable to melee attacks might actually encourage you to carry a melee weapon and charge into combat like that every once in a while. You know, these aren't the deepest ideas in the world, but traits like that would at least force the player to consider using different weapons or rethink their combat strategy like a little bit, and ideally they would have more modifiers that actually gave enemies entire new abilities, like the fire grenade one. You know, like, what if enemies could deploy like a stationary shield, or even like a physical piece of cover that blocks all attacks from a specific direction, and then that way the player is now forced to leave their cover and try to find a way to flank around that new obstacle in order to get at the enemies. These kinds of things are what they should be keeping in mind when they design these modifiers. You know, just giving the enemies more health or increasing how much damage they do doesn't change how a player approaches a fight. It just makes the fight take longer. They need to consider abilities that actually force the player to change their strategies and reconsider their actions and what order they're going to do things in, which is what these current modifiers fail to do. And that's why I'm almost willing to count this change overall as a positive. It's at the very least not a negative change, because it doesn't really make the combat worse than it already was. The thing is that by having this system in place, at the very least they can now theoretically expand upon it and add some actual good design traits that do change how you approach combat. So, like, this is at least a good foundation that they could improve upon in the future. They just need to actually build something on it that isn't just giving enemies more health or the ability to heal themselves. Ideally, they would also improve things on the player side of the equation, of course. Like, in my opinion, a lot of the guns feel way too similar to each other, and the melee combat somehow feels even worse than it did in Skyrim, a game from over a decade ago. So, you know, ideally they would add some better traits and more depth to the player's combat abilities, but I think that focusing on improving the enemies and actually making the enemies use more in-depth strategies and require the player to adapt to them more would at least be an easier way to improve the game's combat significantly, even if it isn't quite there just yet. But combat is not the only thing in this game. There's also the exploration side of things, which is arguably even more important of an element to get right in a big open-world Bethesda game. And they've done some things to try and improve the exploration systems in Starfield. Like, Okay, for example, one of the big things they added early on was the car. So now you can purchase a vehicle, and anytime you touch down on a planet, it'll automatically spawn right next to your ship, and you can hop on and just drive around whatever planet you're on. And I mean, this feels like the definition of a band-aid solution that fails to address the actual deeper underlying issues with the game. Like, when Starfield first came out, a lot of people, including myself, were clowning on it for just how barren and empty it felt, and especially with how long it would take to walk from your ship to points of interest on a planet, and basically anywhere you wanted to go. It was really long and boring. It was bad. But hey, now they've added a car to the game, so you can get between those boring locations faster. So problem solved, right? But like I said, this is kind of a band-aid fix. It's something that technically improves the game, but fails to address the core underlying problem because it's only a surface level solution. Because, like, yeah, it's better to only spend like 1 minute traveling to a point of interest instead of 5, but the problem is that the map exploration itself is so painfully boring and generic, regardless of how long you spend doing it. If we were to look back at another better designed open world game like Breath of the Wild or Elden Ring or even Bethesda's older games like Skyrim, when you're traveling from one location to another, the game is designed to be very dense with content. You know, you're constantly encountering new enemies to fight, puzzles to solve, items to loot, and at the very least, you're able to look over some beautiful handcrafted environments while you're exploring these worlds. So, like, yeah, the car in Starfield helps solve the problem of having to walk for 5 minutes straight doing nothing on a boring moon by reducing the time to 1 minute or something like that, but it doesn't change the fact that these moons have nothing to do while you're traveling, and there's nothing to look at or be amazed by while you're going from point to point. You're just doing less of the boring stuff, but the boring stuff is still there. And really, this is the real problem I have with most of these changes that I've been looking at with Starfield. Almost everything they have added over the last 2 years is technically an improvement to the game, but most of it is doing very little or only fixing things on a very surface level without really addressing these real underlying problems that people have been complaining about since launch. Another good example of this is the big new cruise mode that they've been advertising a lot for the more recent update, where basically now when you're in your ship, instead of having to use the map screen to fast travel between different planets and stuff, you can now just plug in a destination elsewhere in the solar system, and then your ship will automatically fly to it seamlessly without having to go through a loading screen. And you can even get up and wander around your ship mid-flight to do things like craft items and talk to your crew while your ship is flying from point to point. And like, in theory, I should like this addition a lot. You know, one of my biggest complaints about Starfield is that it's a game where you can build your own spaceship, but you almost never actually have a reason to wander about your ship. You know, space exploration mostly came down to just navigating menus and then fast traveling between planets. And even when you land on a planet, they already included a feature to just immediately teleport from the cockpit to outside of your ship, because they probably realized that walking through your ship over and over again dozens of times was going to get super boring. So, but what that means is that you can literally play through most of Starfield without ever actually looking at the inside of your ship. So having the ability to fly between planets and be given this time to wander about your ship is theoretically what I wanted, but the core fundamental issue with adding this cruise mode for traveling between planets is that the game was designed first around fast travel, and adding a way to travel more slowly now, when the game already has systems in place and expects you to just instantly teleport wherever you want to go, kind of makes this pointless. Like, my options are either to spend a couple minutes flying from one planet to the other, or I could spend a couple seconds just teleporting there instead. So why would I take the slower option when I don't even have to go somewhere first to unlock fast travel for that location? And yes, I know that they added new waypoints like space stations and whatnot that you do have to travel to first the slow way in order to unlock fast travel for them, but it also just kind of makes it feel a bit jarring jarring and arbitrary that you can literally travel instantly between different planets in entire different solar systems. But if you want to travel to a random space station within a solar system you're already in, you have to spend multiple minutes flying there manually. Like, I don't really understand what the logic is there, and it's kind of a product of this ad hoc trying to solve a problem when the game clearly wasn't designed around it. And, like, even if we ignore the option to, fast travel around the universe entirely, the game just isn't designed to make space exploration itself, fun at all. Again, if we look at other open world games like Skyrim or Elden Ring, you are constantly finding new content every time you wander around the world. You don't need to find ways to occupy your time with busy work while you're traveling to the next destination, because the game is naturally designed to make the process of exploration and discovering new areas itself fun and part of the core experience of the game. Whereas in Starfield, in this space exploration game, it feels like the process of exploring space and new planets and new frontiers was more of an afterthought. I mean, think about how many people were blown away, back in Skyrim, when they were just wandering through some random corner of the map, only to stumble upon the entrance to the massive underground city of Blackreach, or a similar moment in Elden Ring, when you find a random structure in a forest, and it ends up taking you so far underground that it's almost comical, before suddenly revealing this beautiful underground starry sky and a whole new area to explore. Starfield just cannot support that kind of exploration and discovery, because everything is always already marked on your map. The entire settled systems are, well, settled. They've already been explored and mapped out. You're never actually going somewhere that nobody's been before. You're not going to suddenly stumble upon a new planet that you didn't know existed while you were just randomly flying about the universe. There's no way to get that moment of like, oh, I'm going from one place to another, but while I'm going there, that looks interesting. Let me just investigate that for a moment. Because everything you do in this game is you select a destination, and then you go to that destination, and then nothing interrupts you from going to that destination apart from maybe a pirate attack or two. So it's like, sure, I can now fly from one planet to another planet completely seamlessly, but like, I still have to go through a loading screen and a fixed animation every time I want to actually land on a planet. So, yeah, getting rid of one of the loading screens was nice, I guess, but it doesn't really change the fact that wandering around this universe feels like a loading screen simulator, as you have to end up jumping between these small instanced locations that just make the exploration feel so disjointed and pointless in this game. It all just feels like boring, busy work, which is not how exploration and discovery should feel. So, yeah, I mean, I could go on about some of the other features they've added and, changed over the years, but I feel like what I've talked about so far covers the main point that I want to make here. Because, like, yeah, it's cool that they let you customize the furniture on your ship now more easily with, like, the outpost building system, but they don't address the main annoyances I have with these systems, like how it's still hard to control where the doors and ladders on your ship are, or the fact that combining ship parts from different shipyards is still a really annoying and time-consuming process. Most of the changes that they've implemented over these last 2 years technically improve the game, the core, the car, the random enemy traits, the ship customization. And I think it's hard to argue that the game isn't at least a little better now than it was 2 years ago, but none of these changes address the core underlying problems with what makes Starfield a deeply unenjoyable game for people like me. When it comes to this idea of, salvaging a game that had a bad reception at launch and turning it into something beloved down the line, I feel like there's really only two kinds of games that have this happen, and they're exemplified very well with Cyberpunk and No Man's Sky. When Cyberpunk came out, it was in a rough state, but it was able to be fixed because the actual core of the game itself was, in my opinion, still fundamentally good. The story and characters were enjoyable, and I remember falling in love with people like Jackie and Johnny and Judy and I guess apparently everyone with a name that starts with J. The combat had fun fun mechanics. Night City was a cool location that was fun to explore. It was just marred with an overwhelming amount of technical issues that made the game run like shit and turned the whole experience into a hilariously buggy mess. So, when they finally started fixing the game, ultimately all they really needed to do was make surface level changes to fix the whole process, fixing up the bugs, making some improvements to enemy AI, tweaking some of the talents in the level up screen to make them a little bit more fun. They didn't really have to change the core of the game because that was already good. It was just hard to really see it through all of its problems. But without that good foundation that Cyberpunk had, these kinds of minor updates to Starfield just aren't going to turn things around anytime soon. So, if they actually do want to make a difference, if they really want to turn around Starfield and make it into something really great, you kind of have to take the No Man's Sky approach, because No Man's Sky was also very bad at launch, and not unlike Starfield, it relied on things like way too much, like procedural generation, and just giving the player tons of busy work to do. The planets in the galaxy, despite being massive, were just not very fun to explore after the first few hours, and if the game very quickly became very samey and repetitive. There just wasn't all that much to do, not to mention the completely underwhelming main story and its own ending. But in the time since No Man's Sky's launch, they have put so much work into this game and added so many major updates. Entire core systems have been reworked from the ground up, and there have been whole new systems added to the game on top of those. Like, hell, just recently when I started writing this video, they actually put out an update that lets you play Pokemon with the weird random critters you can find. It's crazy how much work they put into this game and continue to do so since its launch. My point being that a game like Starfield can only really be fixed if they are willing to take the No Man's Sky approach, not the Cyberpunk one. The issue with Starfield's gameplay and the combat and exploration, these issues are far too deep for just some simple bug fixes and tweaks to the mechanics to really solve anything. They need to rework entire systems, like how the exploration works and how you go around the galaxy. This needs to be changed from the ground up if they want to salvage what they've created here. But, as always, I'm happy to continue the conversation in the comments down below. One last thing that I want to touch on here before I close this out is, there was this interview I remember reading about a month ago where a composer for Starfield made the claim that, we're just not ready for Starfield, and we weren't ready when it came out, and they were more generally alluding to this idea that people tend to come around on Bethesda games over time. One day we will understand the vision behind Starfield, and it'll become a beloved game. And I don't mean to sound rude, but am I living in a different reality from this person? Because in my experience, I feel like people have only really soured on a lot of Bethesda games over time. Fallout 4 got tons of good reviews back in the day when it first came out, but I feel like a lot of people are way more critical on it now. I don't think anybody's defending the nonsensical story and the heavy-handed slavery allegory that was going on throughout that game, and there's tons of random annoyances that people hate, like Preston Garvey, and not to mention a lot of the systems just felt very half-baked, and combat is still kind of mediocre in these Bethesda games. And let's be real here, I feel like the only reason why the more popular Bethesda games like Skyrim are still popular to this day is almost entirely due to fan support and the modding community. If it was impossible to mod Skyrim and you were forced to only ever play it as Bethesda intended, with only Bethesda's official updates and DLC, there is no way that Skyrim would be anywhere near as popular as it is, especially now, 15 plus years down the line. So I feel like it's kind of the opposite of what this guy is saying. It's not that people suddenly start to understand Bethesda's vision over time. Fans are what keeps these games alive. It is the modding community that improves Bethesda games dramatically as the years go on, and that's what keeps them popular and in the public consciousness, even now, a decade or two down the line. But yeah, for now, if you like the video, make sure to leave me a like and hit that subscribe button if you want to see more content like this in the future. And if you want to help support the channel more directly, there's a link to my Ko-Fi in the description down below. Thank you all for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one.